Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday.
Hello everybody, it is Mr. Pete. We are going to finish the Ides of March in The Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt. Of course, Mrs. Sidman was a hero yesterday. We found out that she's back again. Remember, she's been in all kinds of roles at the school, and Doug Switek's brother always seems to kind of get in the way of that. But something bad, of course, happened to her. Caliban and Sycorax fell on top of her, but instead of freaking out, after all that she's been through, she grabbed both rats by the scruffs of their neck and carried them away to the traps that Mr. Vandalism had for them. So she saved the day. We found out that Mrs. Baker was an Olympic silver medalist. We found out that she knows how to coach track, and we know that Holling is about to race on the Ides of March. Prediction time. So make your predictions right now, and the brave ones will post them honestly before I read this chapter. What's going to happen to Holling? That afternoon, Coach Quattrini held his cross-country tryouts. By then, the story of Sycorax and Caliban was all over school, and so we figured that tryouts might be delayed. And it might be that some coaches somewhere would delay a tryout on an afternoon when some of the tryoutees have just been traumatized by two gigantic rats falling out of their classroom ceiling. But Coach Quattrini thought it would give us motivation. The big M, he said. Motivation! You won't run faster unless you really want to run fast. And really wanting to run fast is what gives you motivation. The big M. He had set out a course for us that stretched to some place beyond human endurance. We were supposed to start at the gym doors and go around the parking lot where Sycorax and Caliban were hissing in their cage, waiting for the exterminator to come put them in his truck, past the fence that enclosed the tennis courts, out onto Lee Avenue, down past Goldman's Best Bakery, around in front of the school by the main lobby, behind the elementary school wing, and so back to the gym doors. 4 times, Coach Quattrini said, holding up 4 fingers. You do that round 4 times at tempo. Top 7 will be varsity. That'll be all 8th graders, I expect. The rest of you will be junior varsity, if you're good enough to make that, you dang slugs. And with that encouragement, Coach Quattrini blew his whistle, and we began. The sky had not improved during the day. The green and brown had swirled together, and the clouds had lowered themselves further and further, and they had dropped a kind of vapor from them that made it seem that we were running through the jungles of Vietnam. And breathing more water than air, I leaned forward, and I kept my arms low and my hands loose. I didn't rush it, but even so, by the time I passed Sycorax and Caliban, who hissed and threw themselves against the bars toward me when I kicked their cage to say goodbye, I was already feeling the wet air welling inside me. By the time I came around for the second time, things were slowing down considerably, and every 8th grader and a whole lot of 7th graders were far ahead of me. It's hard to run like Jesse Owens when you're feeling like you're drowning. The 3rd lap was better. Mary Lee was standing by the main lobby, and when I ran past, she held up a dried rose with a ribbon on it. When a girl holds up a rose to you, you run better, let me tell you. By the time I came around for the 4th lap, I was up to Danny. I had even passed some of the 8th graders, and I could see the leaders in front of me again. I ran past the gym doors. Can't you go any faster? From Coach Quattrini, and out into the parking lot where the exterminator truck had pulled up to unload Sycorax and Caliban into their new cage. The sky had lowered itself even more, and everything looked like we were seeing it from underwater in a greenish haze. Even sounds were muffled so that my footsteps seemed to come from far away. But what wasn't muffled was the cry that came from the exterminator behind me. The sound of a large cage dropping, a scream, and the clicking of clacking teeth. I looked back, And there were the demon rats, racing with their scabby paws toward me, their eyes filled with the big M, murder, and their pointy heads bobbing up and down with each leap. I couldn't scream. I couldn't get enough air into my lungs for screaming. I could only run, but the faster I ran, the more their yellow hatred grew, and every time I looked back, which was a lot, they were flat out after me, their scabby whispers swept back by their speed, their yellow teeth clacking. I could imagine those teeth sinking into my heels like the assassin's daggers sinking into Caesar. And I ran faster. I'd be running still if the tennis courts hadn't been there. Since they were, I sprinted onto the courts and kicked the wire gate closed behind me. Sycorax and Caliban smashed into the gate and poked their yellow scabby snouts through. Then they tried to climb the fence. Really, they started to climb up the fence, never taking their red eyes off me. Fear can bring out the big M. I ran across the courts, and I was up and over the far side of the fence before they were up and over the near side one. By that time, Mr. Goreshi, who had heard all the screaming, was trying to get the exterminator to go inside the tennis courts to catch the rats. But the exterminator wouldn't go near them. "Did you see those teeth?" he said. He got into his truck and drove a safe distance away. Meanwhile, Sycorax and Caliban were climbing up the far side fence after me. Before they reached the ground outside, the entire schoolyard had emptied, me last, when Danny Hupfer grabbed me from where I'd been standing in paralyzed horror. So what happened after that is all a guess. At the same time that Sycorax and Caliban hit the bottom of the fence and ran into the parking lot looking for me, a school bus was coming back in for the late afternoon run. The driver later said that she saw the rats and tried to swerve, but that they leapt onto their hind legs and jumped in front of her. She slammed down on her brakes, but the rats stood their ground, their paws up, their snouts pulled back, their yellow teeth clacking, their demon eyes flashing, none of which you'd have been able to recognize among the squashed bits when the bus, after skidding on the suddenly slick asphalt, finally came to a stop. And as the exterminator drove away, since there was nothing more for him to do, the green and brown sky finally opened, and the rain came down in torrents, so fast it blew sideways. And when it had raged for about the time it takes to run 2 laps around Camillo Junior High, it stopped, and the green sky evaporated, and it was the Ides of March, a beautiful spring day. A new record was set for the 3-mile run for a Long Island school that afternoon, and I'm including high schools here. People said afterward that they had never seen anything like it. That kind of speed from a 7th grader. So I made the varsity team and had the big M to keep running, especially since it stayed beautiful for the rest of March as the days grew longer. So long that it was still light when my father and sister came home from Hood and Associates at supper time. I practiced every afternoon after school with the other varsity runners, me, the only 7th grader, while the sun was yellow and warm and the sky blue and white. I ran leaning forward, my arms and legs like pistons, head straight and still, hands loose, breathing controlled. I ran like Jesse Owens with the big M. Meanwhile, the story of the rats grew larger. People went to visit the spot where they had met the bus. Doug Switek's brother had 2 teeth that he claimed were from Caliban, and he would show them to you for a quarter. Mrs. Sidman was the most heroic figure of the story, and even first graders were drawing pictures of her carrying Caliban and Sycorax through the halls of Camillo Junior High. And all of those pictures, she looked like the warrior that Ariel had wanted to be, stern and serious and powerful. A 3rd grader drew a coat of arms for her with 2 dead rats beneath her feet. Charles, the 5th grader of the lovely handwriting, inscribed the motto beneath, "To the death!" The D had a whole lot of swirling loops inside it. The only one who came out badly in the stories was my T. And honestly, I couldn't figure it out. No one but my T had stood her ground beside Mrs. Sidman while all the rest of us scrammed across the room. But instead of her getting a coat of arms and being made into a warrior, people started to talk about her, and not just behind her back, but so that she could hear them, about how people in Vietnam ate rats, how she was just hoping for a good meal, how she thought they were rat burgers on the run, stuff like that. Remember, we talked about the vandalism earlier in the book, and this is 1,000% stereotype, 1,000% racism, 1,000% discrimination. And what I've always loved about this book is it doesn't hide it. My-T is a great person. I mean, we don't know her that well, but she's there because her parents are dead, and that's not her fault. And they weren't Viet Cong soldiers. They were part of South Vietnam. They were just people who lived in a village, and she was just a person who lived in a village. So people were making fun of her, which is unfortunate. Until one day, when outside the yellow forsythia branches were weaving themselves together, and the daffodils were playing their trumpets, and the lilacs were starting to bud and getting all giddy, we were going through the lunch line, and Mrs. Biggio handed My-T her tuna casserole surprise. And one of the penitentiary-bound 8th graders said loudly to Mrs. Biggio, "Don't you have any rat surprise for her?" And then he turned to My-T and said, "Why don't you go back home where you can find some?" And then My-T started to cry, just stood there crying. And Danny took his entire tray, which was filled with tuna casserole surprise, and 2 glasses of chocolate milk, and red jello with peaches, and dumped it over the penitentiary-bound 8th grader's stupid head. And then, before the 8th grader could open his stupid eyes to see who had done it, Danny punched him as hard as he could and broke his stupid nose, which got Danny a 4-day suspension, which Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer used to take him to Washington, D.C., because they were so proud of him. Side note, I would never promote punching anybody in the face. He obviously was defending somebody who was being treated really badly. Someone being racist in front of the whole entire lunchroom. And Danny maybe didn't handle it in a graceful way, but he also was going against being Rule 4. Could there have been a better way to do it? Probably, yes. But as a reader, when I read that line, was I glad that kid got punched? At lunch recess on the day he came back, he told us about climbing the Washington Monument, touring the White House, seeing Hubert Humphrey waving from a limousine, sprinting up the Capitol steps 3 at a time, running at tempo through the maze of fences the police were putting up to control the demonstration that Martin Luther King Jr. was bringing to Washington next month, and walking up to President Lyndon Baines Johnson and shaking his hand, all of which we believed, except for the last part. But this next part is no lie. When we got back in from recess, Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Baker were holding 2 trays filled with fried bananas. Really, fried bananas rolled in crushed nuts, dipped in coconut, and topped with caramel sauce. Warm caramel sauce. Can you imagine what all 4 of those together smelled like? Sweet and fruity and spicy and warm and creamy and chewy, all at the same time. That's about as close as I can get. It's the kind of smell that makes you hungry just thinking about it. Mrs. Baker held the tray like she was carrying gold and frankincense and myrrh. "It's a recipe from Vietnam," she said. "Mrs. Biggio has made them for our class." We cheered. "The caramel sauce is called Nuoc Mao. Did I say that correctly, My-T Huang?" My-T shrugged and smiled, and Mrs. Baker laughed. And then she and Mrs. Biggio walked up and down the aisles, and we each took a plate with fried bananas smothered in caramel sauce on it. And when Mrs. Biggio got to My-T, she stopped and lifted a plate down onto her desk and said, "I am so sorry, My-T. I am so sorry." There's so much to digest there. So, Mrs. Biggio, who has been pretty nasty to My-T throughout the story, doesn't matter how many times I read this part, but anyways, she, you could tell maybe the last time she put her head down after she did something stupid. She saw what happened in the lunchroom, and Eventually, her and Mrs. Baker created this cultural experience so that the kids could learn something about Métis culture, which is something I used to do a lot in North Carolina because there were so many different cultures that I would teach. Parents would come in and bring like stuff that they would eat from countries that they're from. And this is something that Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Baker did, not only to make Métis feel more welcome, but to allow the class to get to know the culture. A lot of times people are racist or have stereotypes about others because they don't realize anything about their culture. So Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Baker are trying to break down that barrier. And the apology after that was spectacular. So Mrs. Biggio has dealt with her grief, and now Métis has another ally. Very nice. That night, Walter Cronkite reported that in Khe Sanh, some of the tunnels the Viet Cong were digging now reached to within 50 yards of the Marine fences. There were more mortar shells lobbed in. There were more pictures of the Marines deep in their bunkers with their hands over their ears. Casualties were light, the White House announced. In Camillo Junior High, we ate fried bananas with warm nuoc mao. We sang a song that Métis taught us about bananas, though it could have been about elephants, and we wouldn't have known it, since we only knew 2 words of Vietnamese. And when we were done, Mrs. Biggio and Métis held each other tightly, and it seemed to all of us that they did not want to let go. Okay, we're going to stop there. No need to debrief. On to April.
I'm waiting for Wednesday to show you goodbye. I don't wanna be here. And I'm waiting for Wednesday to show you goodbye. To show you goodbye.